Okay, Teresa, take it away.
All right. Good evening and welcome to session 6 of our presentations. Take the Red Pill, Predictive Analysis of the Human Condition. Your Zoom host is Lisa Hune, and I will be your moderator, Teresa Carter. Our first presentation is Ancestry through Facial Recognition. Its lead will be Cody Mudrack. Its team is Sam Holland, Audrey Johns, and Andrew Burton. We turn it over to Cody.
Sorry about that. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay. So there are several companies out there nowadays that you can like send them a cheek swab or something like that, and they'll give you an ancestry record that, you know, you're this percentage, this race, this percentage, this race. And we were wondering if you could do kind of the same thing through facial recognition, if you could take a picture of someone's face, run some software, and figure out where they come from. So currently, there really isn't a technology that uses facial recognition to determine ancestry to the extent of genealogy. The point of this project is to explore the feasibility of using facial recognition as a simple solution to determine a person's ancestral background, and we're also going to look at the ethical considerations of that.
So facial recognition really took off in 2014 with the development of something called the Gaussian face algorithm out of the University of Hong Kong. For the first time with this algorithm, a machine was able to more accurately predict whether two facial images belong to the same person. In the past, it was possible, but with changes in facial expression or lighting, the accuracy of the AI would go down drastically, whereas a person, of course, could tell whether two pictures of this are of the same person, whether they're making a serious face or a silly face. So the way the Gaussian face algorithm worked was by first normalizing the two photos by breaking them down into smaller images of 150 by 120 pixels, and then further dividing those up into very tiny 25 by 25 pixel images. So what the algorithm was looking at that point is a very small, maybe like the corner of a mouth or the slope of an eyelid, and it would compare those very small pictures to the other photos images and then make the determination there. And this was very accurate, but it took up a lot of CPU resources to break down the image and then build it back up. So in 2015, Google fixed that problem with FaceNet, which eliminated that intermediate picture breakdown step and instead assigned integer values to facial features and then placed those integers into arrays and then placed those arrays onto a coordinate plane so that a large nose, for example, would be very far away from a small nose on that coordinate plane. At that point, it was easy enough for the algorithm to say, okay, this array is very far away from this one, they must be different pictures. This resulted in a slightly higher accuracy at a fraction of the CPU costs. So after all this development, we started to see some pushback against this stuff in 2018. For example, the University of Toronto developed a sort of anti-facial recognition AI. Its job was to follow along with the work that the facial detection AI was doing, and it could tell what pixel it was looking at in an image. So it would change that pixel just the slightest, and this change wouldn't be perceptible to a human eye, but the work that was being done by the facial recognition AI was completely distorted, and the accuracy of the AI went down greatly. So today, in 2020, we see a pretty big split between the two trains of thought on whether this stuff should be used or not. In China, it is now a requirement for any legitimate purchase of a cell phone that the customer's face be taken and put into a database free for government use. The opposite of that would be here in the States. Cities like Oakland and San Francisco have completely outlawed any kind of government use of facial recognition AI. And we would expect in the coming months for the rest of this year to see some pretty substantial federal legislation against facial AI.
So with all of that progression and the development of facial recognition, as Sam was talking about, there's been some people who think it's wrong to use and other people who think it's right. But with those developments, there's come this question into maybe a better way to use facial recognition, or at least a different one. And that is to answer the question, what can our face tell us about ourselves? What secrets are hidden in our facial features that can be used to determine different aspects about ourselves? And so with that question, there's come a lot more research into facial features and dimensions of facial features. Really in the past 10 years, this research has really taken off. And with that research has come some information that facial recognition can actually be used to discover ethnicity. There's certain dimensions of the face, such as the forehead height, the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, that when you measure them and then compare them across ethnic groups, you can actually place certain measurements within a certain ethnic group. So using technology that Sam described to measure those different features, you can compare them and determine an ethnic background just from a facial scan. There's an experiment done in China in 2018 across 3 different Chinese ethnic backgrounds, so still almost a sub-ethnic background that was almost 80% accurate just using specific regions of the face. And that's where this type of facial recognition differs from the identity recognition or biometric facial recognition that we use. Those models scan the whole face and then compare those, whereas ethnicity recognition had to kind of develop into scanning certain regions of the face and focusing specifically on those. And once that switch was made, they became much more accurate. So these machines use those specific regions and use vast data sets of information and facial scans to learn the differences between ethnicities so that they become accurate when you put in a facial scan. So what we were wanting to ask is, with this technology already trending in this direction, can it be taken further? Can this technology be used not only to determine an ethnic background, but can it be used to determine maybe your family background and your family group that you belong to? And so in that research, we discovered that face shape is genetic and it's influenced by environment. These 2 factors kind of go hand in hand with each other. And they really have an effect on what the face looks like as you grow up. So these environmental variables that come into play often take place early during the first part of a pregnancy. And they can be influenced by so many factors, being alcohol consumption, body products with heavy metals in them. So there's a huge number of variables that can go into what your face looks like after you're born. There's also a question about these traits and these environmental traits. We're not sure exactly how they're passed on from generation to generation. We can identify some of the genes that have effects, but we're still not sure exactly how those are passed on. And so this kind of brings up a lot of gray area and fogginess to this question of, can we peg down and use these facial features to determine which family you're from? So with that, we looked at, or we were kind of asking the question and going into the fact that there's not really enough data and enough distinguishing features in a certain family or a certain bloodline to really determine that. And that's kind of the conclusion we came to, was that because there's not enough data to determine that there's a specific region or part of the face that can determine to that level of accuracy and to that level of specificity, that there's not enough data to determine that. So we cannot use facial recognition at this time to determine someone's ancestry. In order for that to happen, we're going to need to, like we did with ethnicity recognition, have an extensive amount of data that we can look and find patterns across families, which will come, I think, as we continue to do research in genetics, but we're not there yet.
So when you're dealing with large data sets like this, and you're dealing with a lot of personal data like that, the ethics of using that data have to be discussed. So the ancestry detection that we're looking at would use facial recognition. And facial recognition uses biometrics, which is a term for body measurements or calculations. And many companies are taking advantage of this. Apple uses it in their cell phones for their face ID to unlock their phones. Their older phones use a thumbprint. A lot of other phones do this as well. And as Sam said, Google started using it in their FaceNet so that you can just go to their Photos app, type in the name of somebody, and then pictures of that person that you have would show up. And that does it automatically. The thing about biometrics is that biometrics are extremely personal. You can be identified by like a bank account or a credit card number, but that's not those aren't a part of you like your thumbprint would be, or your fingerprints. If your bank account gets stolen or your credit card gets stolen, you can simply just freeze the card and your bank gives you a new card. Whereas if your biometric data happens to be stolen, there's really not much you can do. The information's lost to the thief. You can't just change your fingerprint. You can't just change your face. So this brings up a really good question of, is someone entitled to their own biometric data? You know, should photo IDs be used for a driver's license, for example? Well, there was a paper by Anton Alderman called A Piece of Yourself, Ethical Issues in Biometric Identification. And he argues that no, there should not be any mandatory biometric data for being collected for social privileges, such as getting a driver's license. And his main argument is that photos can be used to harass other people, photos can be used to discriminate and defame other people, so the less of them we have, kind of the better off we are. And I don't necessarily agree with this viewpoint, because there's billions and billions and billions and billions of photos out there, and a tiny, tiny fraction of them are being used for criminal activity. The possible positives that come from this and the increased security benefits far outweigh all the downsides of having a lot of pictures. Another argument is by Teresa Carter, who is one of the nation's foremost authorities on cybersecurity. And she points out that in an age of mass data, it is extremely easy to use that data for discrimination. Think of an employer looking at a potential employee. He goes and looks up their information online, sees that they have a genetic condition, and says, I don't want to hire that person because I don't want to pay for their health insurance. Obviously there are laws against that, but that doesn't stop that guy from just producing a cover-up reason or something like that. Another thing is, if this facial recognition for Ancestry were to get really accurate, you could use that to discriminate against people, like even inadvertently. If you take a picture of your neighbor and you run it through the software and discover he's from a certain ancestral background, you might inadvertently treat him differently, and that's just never good. But on the positive side of things, knowing where you come from can give you a great sense of pride and a great sense of belonging. But the problem is that that technology can also be used to heavily discriminate against other people. And having more information is key to making informed decisions, but it's just, we need to use that information and all this mass data, especially when it comes to facial recognition, to improve humanity and not to tear it down. The current state, as a conclusion, the current state of facial recognition is extremely accurate, actually. Facial recognition is oftentimes more accurate than a person is. But the problem with ancestry detection is using facial recognition for ancestry detection is extremely, extremely poor. There are numerous factors that come into play on how the head and the face are shaped, and some of them have nothing to do with ancestry. So this makes it a poor choice for determining the basis of ancestry, and the feasibility of using facial recognition to detect ancestry has a lot of potential, but it has yet to show evidence of its practicality or or its accuracy, and also all of the ethical issues that go along with that just further complicate the issue. Special thanks to Dr. Teresa Carter and the rest of the distributed systems class. Thank you guys. Any questions?
We have one question that I'll direct to Cody. Can it be possibly used for disease recognition, and such as changes in place, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, anything that type? And I'm directing this to Cody because he is CEO of the robotics team, and we are doing image recognition there for particular diseases. So Cody, if you want to elaborate on that question.
I don't know too much about how diseases progress. By a single photo, I think it would be extremely difficult to be able to recognize a disease unless it's like a skin condition or something like that. But like something like Alzheimer's that progresses in stages, I think it would be pretty difficult off a single photo to be able to detect that. Now, if you had a series of photos, like this photo was taken at this date, this time it was taken a year later, and this, so forth. That might be able to be used to do that, to see the progression. There might be certain physical features that a disease affects over time that might be able to be picked up by facial recognition, but just off a single photo, I highly would doubt that.
Drew, do you want to add to that question, to that answer?
Yes, I did some research in that, and there actually is some developmental data into that question. There's actually a mobile application that was released recently. It's called Face to Gene, and it scans facial recognitions, particularly with the conditions like cleft palate. And there was a couple other ones that they don't diagnose it, but they can give doctors suggestions as to, because of these certain facial features, you might want to test for these specific conditions. So that data is progressing. That software is progressing. It hasn't been completely to the point of diagnosing data yet, but they are giving suggestions based off of certain diseases that do have that effect on the body.
Thank you. If there's no other questions, we will move to the next team, to the next presentation. Thank you very much. So our next presentation is Predicting the Spread of COVID-19 with Artificial Intelligence. Your lead will be Ryan Kelly. Your team is Yhorman Prieto, Jarod Blazo, Michael Bolding, and Filmon Kidane. So we'll let Ryan take over.
Can everybody see my screen?
Okay. Yes, thank you.
So for our project, we looked into predicting COVID-19 with AI.
We never thought that the world would be facing the coronavirus or a giant epidemic like it is now. And really, because of that, we got to be on guard for other viruses, because they evolve so fast. And last year, before the coronavirus, the flu had unprecedented death tolls and illness rates. And now scientific leaders were exploring more the methods which we can use to early detect pandemics and stop them in their tracks. And then if there was a pandemic happening, how we can mitigate the effects of that pandemic.
All right, so for our study, we competed on a website that does all sorts of competitions for AI called Kaggle.com. And the reason we did that is that the website provides a large amount of data that's also very easy to use for AI and always from very reliable sources. So in this case, all of our data was provided from Johns Hopkins University data on the spread of COVID-19. So that data consisted of the different confirmed cases and fatalities in countries and regions throughout the world, starting on individual days in January through March. Using that data, we actually have 3 iterations of our AI. So the first one consisted of it took just the date and the region and attempted to make a prediction on the spread of the disease in that area. And it did that through a deep learning algorithm called a random forest regressor, which took the original part of the data, which was for information that we already knew. So that would be the days leading up to the competition. And then it made predictions for the days following the competition based on that data. So our first iteration was just the date and the region. Our second iteration tried to make further predictions based off of past predictions. So that came about by we had seen in some of our testing that you could more accurately predict the number of cases in an area if you knew the number of fatalities in an area. So what it did is it actually had 2 AI. There were 2 AI involved in the second iteration. The first one was identical to the original iteration that just took the date and the region and made a prediction. The second one would then take the predictions from the first one and it would try to make further predictions based on that. So try to confirm cases based on the date and the region, and then the fatalities from the first AI, and then it would also do the same thing with date, region, and confirmed cases for fatalities as well. And so what we ended up finding with that was that it was actually, once used to actually submit to the competition, it was less accurate than any of the 3 models. So we ended up not researching that one further. And then the third iteration of the model did away with the predictions based on previous predictions and just included country, state, population, area, the continent that it was on, and the latitude and the longitude of each country. And so that ended up being our most accurate iteration. And I will pass it off to Jarod so he can tell you about our results.
Yeah, so we ended up actually placing 121st out of 144. Now there's constant updates to that competition, and just before presenting this, I found that we are now 124th out of 244. So our results are not bad at all. The score of 0.57993 is calculated using a root mean logarithmic error. And so it's essentially a very complex method of assigning a score between 0 and 1 to find how accurate your results are. So you'd want to be as close to 0 as possible, the ideal scoring being 0.0. And so our findings were actually that the country, region, population, area, latitude, longitude, and continent were what helped to make the most accurate predictions. Ryan stated previously that the competition only fed us the data of the country and the state, and I believe one more data point. But we actually found external data that included the region, population, area, et cetera, and by compiling that data and using that for the AI, we were able to increase our accuracy significantly. And Ryan spoke a little bit about that dual AI approach, and we found that to be pretty ineffective, regardless of what our initial results showed, because the data that it produced just became inaccurate over time, and it didn't hold true to what the results should have been. So
doing this research, we had some limitations and some problems doing the AI to make it perfectly. First, we didn't have enough time to properly train the AI to predict the course of COVID-19, and we didn't have enough information about every factor that affects the spread of COVID-19, like the amount of people traveling from countries and from where they're traveling, depending on how the COVID-19 spread on that country. And without this information, we couldn't properly train the AI to predict the course of COVID-19 in the future and fatality rates.
Okay, for a predictive artificial intelligence software to work best, it needs to be provided with accurate and up-to-date information. So our research provides just that. So in future epidemics, our studies can be used as a jumping point into overcoming the adversities we have had with predicting the actual rate of spread with COVID-19. Our research can also offer the researchers more time and more accurate information. In turn, can help researchers focus the problem on providing more effective solutions and policies to prevent future pandemics. Yeah.
So that pretty much covers everything that we did with our research.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, if not, we will move to the next presentation. If you want to take your screen down, there you go. Thank you. This presentation is Cooperate, and it is being presented by Ben Campbell. Ben, take it away.
All right, before I start screen sharing, I want us to play a little game here. Well, it's actually going to be each of us. So it's going to be a game between you and an imaginary opponent. All right. So, and I want to see how you would play this game. So in this game, there are just two players, you and your imaginary opponent. And there are two options that each of you can make, two different moves. You have option C and option D. Now the way this works is if both of you choose option C, both of you get 3 points. If both of you choose option D, both of you get 2 points. But if one of you chooses option D and the other option C, the one who chooses option D gets 5 points, and the other who chooses option C walks away with nothing. So I want you to raise your hands, and I want to see what each of you would do in this situation. Is everyone clear? All right. So who chooses option C? Option D? Okay. All right. Well, what you just played, and I'll start the screen sharing right now, is called The Prisoner's Dilemma. And it's a very well-known game in game theory. And basically, C stands for cooperate, and D stands for defect. And basically, no matter what the other player does, you will always score higher by defecting than by cooperating. So that's why defecting is called strategy. But if both people defect, both of them will score lower than if they had both cooperated. So as you can imagine, it's pretty wonky. And when you change the game a little bit, it changes the strategies a lot. And if you sub in, say, profits or chances of survival and reproduction for points, you can see how this might be applicable to evolutionary biology or economics. And so now imagine that you play this game and then you take out a die, you roll the die, and then if it lands on a 1, you don't play again. But if it lands on anything but a 1, you do play again. That can allow you to, this is what's called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. And basically what it allows for is for you to play as long as it goes. But basically, if you look at, so just to help you, if you see my mouse, you can see that it plays over and over again, and we have this little, so each time you play the prisoner's dilemma, that's one turn in the iterated prisoner's dilemma. And as you can see, this W right down here is the probability that you will play the next round, which if you're playing a 6-sided die is 5 out of 6. But you can vary W. But we'll get to that in a moment. So this can allow for you to, you can predict what the other player will do in an amount of time. And this also allows you to punish them if they defect against you by defecting against them in the next round. And so there are infinite possible strategies. You can think of just as many as you can name. And there have actually been tournaments where people have submitted strategies and competed against one another in this game. So, but I want us to focus on strategies that only can remember the last 3 turns. So if we do that, basically, a strategy that does that can be expressed in a sequence of 70 ones and zeros. So to demonstrate this, you can think about, okay, what if both of us defect on 3 turns ago, and both of us defect 2 turns ago, and then both of us defect on the last turn? What am I going to do next? That's one possible scenario. Then another possible scenario is this one right here. And then, so there are 6 different boxes that can be filled in, each one with 2 possible ways, D or C. And so if you fill in, so that gives, so if we're trying to teach a computer to play this game, we have to tell it what to do in each of these 64 2 to the power of 6 different scenarios. And so what it does can, of course, be expressed as either a D or a C. And for each D, we can assign a 1, and for each C, we can assign a 0. Now, this only tells us, this is only 64. It doesn't tell us what to do on the first 3 moves, because on the first 3 moves, there was no 3 turns ago. So there's nothing on this this catalog of 64 different things that tells us what to do. So the first 6, so you need 6 additional ones and zeros to tell you what to do on the first 3 turns. And so your computer can generate a population of random strategies, a random 60-digit number. It can generate a bunch of random 70-digit numbers as strategies and pit them against each other. So, and and then what it can do is then take the highest scoring strategies, and it can make, and it can take and change each one of them by just a little bit. So take and alter a certain number of those ones and zeros, and then replicate them in the next generation, and then pit them against each other, and so on and so forth. So as you can see here, so with this one, so you can see this appears to be this appears to be selecting for light pigment, and as you can see, there's 4 little dots here in each generation, and so the popular this is 4, and this whole 199 generations is an observation in my experiment. So what I do is I take and I have the computer generate a bunch of random strategies, and I've written a computer program that generates a bunch of random strategies, selects the top 25% after it's pitted them against each other, and takes that and replicates it with a certain mutation, and we have a mutation rate, which is the proportion of those ones and zeros that were flipped to, so a 1 would become a 0 and a 0 would become a 1. It's a mutation rate. So if you think about this as an ecosystem with certain environmental factors like a mutation rate, which could be affected by, say, radiation or various other mutagens, and perhaps the meet again chances, the double that we were talking about last time, the probability that the next turn would be played in this iterated prisoner's dilemma, that can be affected by how dense the population is. If you think about 2 organisms being the likelihood that they'll meet again. And so the experiment is, for each observation, I ran the simulation for 200 generations, keeping the meet again probability, W, that we talked about earlier, the population size and the mutation rate, the same for each generation. And for the second half of the generations, I computed the percentage of turns where both players cooperated, so CC, and I called that the cooperation rate. And I took the average of those, and that was my dependent variable for the observation. And so basically what I'm taking is I'm taking these environmental factors, and I'm seeing how they affect the viability of cooperative strategies in this simulation. I'm plugging numbers into a computer program that I've written and seeing what comes out. So I used this data. I took 200 observations and I used them to estimate a model using ordinary least squares. I used them to estimate the parameters for a model. And this is what I got. So as you can see, as would be expected, if you're going to see someone again, you're not going to be a jerk to them the first time around if you think you're going to see them again. But people flip each other off on the streets a whole lot because if you're driving, what's the chance that you're going to see that person again? So if you're going to see something again, that the meet again chances again has a positive coefficient, which means that it encourages cooperation. There's a negative coefficient on the population size and a negative coefficient on the mutation rate as well. And the data I got was pretty good. The significance of this regression was pretty high, but it only explains about 1/3 of the variation, which I think the other could probably just be chalked up, or almost certainly just be chalked up to just the randomness in the initial random strategies that were generated. So in this, again, I only looked at higher meet again chances and only lower mutation rates, as you can see right here. So, yeah, that's pretty much my research right now. So, any questions?
Unmuted. Okay. Are there any questions for Ben? Okay. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next presentation. Can personality predict leadership? And this is with Hannah Short. Hannah, we're going to let you do your presentation.
Yay! All right, let me just get my screen up. All right, can y'all see it?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Okay. So what makes a leader a leader? Some of us seem to be born with natural proclivities towards leadership, and so making some of us naturally born leaders. But why is that? Why are some people more prone to be leaders while others are not? What personality traits make us more likely to be healthy and effective leaders? So I guess you could say my burning question for the day is what personality traits make us more, how does our personality affect our ability or our desire to lead? So leadership is kind of a wishy-washy term, the technical term, and it's very subjective in a lot of our everyday conversations. When I say leadership, you might think of a specific position or a general feeling of like social fluency that grants this person great influence. You might even just think about, great world leaders and what they've done. But for the scope of this research, I decided to define it as the desire for or the past or current possession of a leadership position. So to find out which personality traits most affected our desire or ability to lead, I created a survey on SurveyMonkey, which is a somewhat free survey distribution service. And I included 10 questions, and I asked for participants' age, gender, and year in school, as all of my participants are college students anywhere from the ages of 18 to 23. I also asked them 4 yes or no questions. I asked them, do you desire a leadership position? Do you have one currently? Do you plan on applying to one in the future? Or do you, have you ever had one in the past? I also asked them to take a shortened version of the Ocean Personality Test, which you might be more familiar with as the Big 5 personality test. And then I sent it on its way. Dr. Campbell was very helpful in helping me. He sent this survey out to several of his classes. So I got about 43 responses, but then sadly, SurveyMonkey would not let me see 3 of them as it is only somewhat free. And then 7 of my responses were unusable as some of the questions were left unanswered. So in all, I had 33 respondents, which isn't a huge sample size, but I just thought it was really fun to test the data that I got after I put it in Excel and just ran regressions on it and test relationships between the various variables. So I just want to go a little bit into the Ocean Personality Test just to give some background on why I chose this one versus other personality tests. Because you might think of like Myers-Briggs, as a good one to use, or, like what kind of pizza am I? And the feeling of like, wow, I totally relate to this personality test. It totally gets me. And, like as fun as that is, I just didn't think that would be a very good fit for this research. So the Ocean test, I chose this one because it's just been widely used and it's very much validated through a lot of different uses, and it's very consistent across countries and cultures and such. So it first found its origins in the 1960s with Raymond Cattell, who defined the personality in 16 different traits, which is significantly more than 5. And not long after, American psychologist Louis Goldberg refined those to 5 traits that are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. This research caught the eyes of psychologists Paul Costa and Robert McCrae, and the 2 of them used this research to, they used it just across different cultures, countries, and continents. So they just took it all over the place, and this really bolstered its viability and its validity. And after a while, they decided to name it the Big 5 model, and it has since become the most used personality test or personality parameter in psychology. So as examples, I've listed about 4 articles that I used in my research. They're ones that I cited, just to give you an idea of where it can be used and how it can be applied. So the first one talks a lot about how extroversion affects a person's ability to be fluent in not just their own language, but other languages as well. So basically it talks about how people who score higher in extroversion tend to be more comfortable engaging in speaking and like to speak more, and therefore can use language to a fuller extent in some cases. The second article talks about how when a group of people lose some weight, a certain portion of them will become regainers, according to the authors. And conscientiousness, the higher score of conscientiousness someone had, it showed that they did not regain the weight to such a degree. So people who scored higher in conscientiousness also seemed to engage in healthier behaviors in general. So that was a way that they could use personality traits to predict health in some ways. And the third one talks about neuroticism and how it can really be a public health issue in some cases, just because it probably has the most impact on the personality as a negative impact. It's not a good thing in most cases to have higher scores, just because people who have higher scores of neuroticism are more prone to depression and anxiety, which could become a public health issue in some cases. And finally, the last one talks about how gender differences are existent in the personality traits, and also talks about traits being different across generational cohorts. But I focused more of my reading on the gender differences, which I get into a little bit later on in some of my research. So I just wanted to also define the traits just a little bit, just so that way nothing is ill-defined or misunderstood during this presentation. So openness describes just how open someone is to new experiences, which is pretty self-explanatory. It is split into various subcategories, including openness to ideas or openness to aesthetics and feelings. Conscientiousness entails overall detail orientation and has 6 subsets, including order, virtue, traditionalism, self-control, responsibility, and industriousness. Extroversion refers how sensitive an individual is to dopamine releases in the brain, with those with higher levels of extroversion requiring more dopamine releases in order to feel satisfied, which explains why extroversion doesn't really have anything to do with how outgoing someone is, but just has more to do with how much they seek stimulating activities in order to feel emotional satisfaction. Agreeableness has a lot to do with just like how nice someone is. Someone who is cooperative, according to Psychology Today, is cooperative, polite, kind, and friendly. And in addition, people high in agreeableness are more trusting, affectionate, and altruistic. Neuroticism, like I said, is probably one of the most impactful, but albeit negative. Neuroticism measures the effect of negative emotions such as anger, anxiety, self-consciousness, irritability, emotional instability, and depression. People with elevated levels of neuroticism respond poorly to environmental stress, interpret ordinary occurrences as threatening, and experience minor frustrations as hopelessly overwhelming. And like I mentioned, this trait has the most effect and can actually predict diseases later on in life, such as Alzheimer's or dementia. So I started looking into my data, and the first thing that I decided to do was to take my variables age, year, and gender and see what effects they had on each trait's percentages. So what I found was, after running the different regressions, these were the models that I found. So what I found, openness was most affected by age, which makes sense. I mean, you go to college to learn to have an open mind, and you go to just learn to experience new things, and you have to be open to that. And I feel like openness is something that you gain as you mature. Extroversion was not affected by age, but that kind of makes sense, as you don't really see extroversion increase with age most of the time. You more expect it to be a fixed personality trait in a lot of ways. Conscientiousness was most affected by gender, but from what studies I've read, gender differences between these 3 categories are not consistent, or they're mostly negligible. So disregarding that one, gender really didn't have a whole lot of impact on conscientiousness, although it does have some impact on various subcategories. However, gender did have very clear effects on agreeableness and neuroticism, and this has been constant in whatever studies I've looked at. This has been a consistent trait across cultures, ages, and races. Like it's very consistent. It's not equal everywhere, but it is a consistent difference, with a low agreeableness and low neuroticism at one end of a certain spectrum, and high neuroticism and high agreeableness at the other end. Men tend to fall on the lower end, and women tend to fall on the higher ends of that spectrum. And that is clearly reflected in my research here, to see that agreeableness and neuroticism were mostly affected by gender. An interesting thing too about that is that those differences are actually seen more in industrialized countries like the US than they are seen in third world countries. which is almost counterintuitive to what people would normally assume. So then I decided to go into how do those specific traits and those percentages affect one's desire or current or past possession of a leadership position. So I decided to run each of the 5 traits against each question that I asked them. And so desire was most affected by extroversion and negatively affected by agreeableness, which makes sense to me as, you know, if you're going to go and ask for leadership positions, or if you're going to go in and seek one out, you're probably going to be seeking new experiences and seeking new stimulating activities. And I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but in my personal experience, most people who I know who are great leaders tend to tell me that they never wanted a leadership position. And they're some of the most agreeable people I know. So maybe the negative impact of agreeableness makes sense because they maybe just want a leadership position for the sake of it. I'm not saying that's in all cases, but maybe that could be an explanation. Whether or not someone currently holds a leadership position was most predicted by openness, which that also makes sense because if you're going to take on a leadership position that's that can be very mentally and physically taxing in a lot of ways. So you're going to have to be open to new experiences, and also extroversion and agreeableness were close seconds in effects. So that also makes sense that you would have to be willing to be agreeable and extroverted as well. And if you had ever held any positions in high school, was most affected by extroversion, which makes sense to me as well, as when you think about kids who are in high school, a lot of them who were placed in leadership positions such as team captains or student government were the kids that were most engaged in the activities. And they were usually placed there so that way they could learn these leadership skills, and so that way they could, you know, bolster their resume a little bit almost as they're applying to colleges and such. So one of the last things that I asked my respondents was, what do you think is the most important quality in a leader? And I gave them these 9 responses that they could choose from, and communication and honesty were the most often chosen, with confidence and humility being a fairly close second. And that just really makes sense. It reflects a lot of my research. And if you think about communication, you need a lot of openness and conscientiousness in order to be able to communicate clearly with people that you're working with. You have to be able to know how to communicate and what to communicate, and being detail-oriented and industrious would really help in those places. And honesty is something you need to be very open for. You know, if you have low percentages of openness and conscientiousness, you might not be as honest with people. And confidence and humility fall into the category of agreeableness and also conscientiousness. And so having high levels of those 3 traits especially can greatly predict whether or not you desire, have held leadership positions in the past. So in conclusion, I just want to thank you all for listening to my presentation. I know I'm no professional or bona fide personality psychologist, but these are 2 topics that I'm very interested in. Just to see how personality affects the way we live and the way that we interpret the world is extremely interesting. And leadership in and of itself, I think, is like a reflection of our individuality. We all have our own gifts, our own callings, and our own vocations, and we're all, I'm fairly certain, staunchly independent in a lot of ways. And we can accomplish a lot on our own, but we can accomplish even more together. So thank you, guys.
Thank you. Okay, so we have one question for Hannah.
Exciting.
So if extroversion is related to dopamine release, did your background research show if dopamine decreases with age? In other words, may there be a reason why to be an extrovert is not a factor with older individuals?
I didn't see any research on that, but that would make sense. I feel like sometimes it depends on the person, because I feel like I know some people who, as they've gotten older, do seek out more experiences, but also I know some people who tend to kind of go off on their own a little bit more. So I'm sorry, I don't have a clear answer to that one. I didn't see anything about that in my background research.
Any other questions for Hannah? Okay, all right. Well, we want to thank you for being here for this session 6 of our Rise Above presentations, and we thank all of our students who participated in this particular session. You did a great job. Thank you very much, and I've really appreciated being your moderator. So we will turn it back over to our host, Liesl, And I guess we are finished with this session.
Yes, we are. So thank you again for all coming and staying and supporting your classmates. I really appreciate that. I'm going to end the meeting, and we'll have the recording available hopefully by tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.